Before we get things started, I just wanted to quickly talk about what exactly the title of this video means. It isn't meant to be pretentious, hyperbolic, or get a couple cheap views. What the title of this video represents is the best way I can describe this game. Spider-Man: Edge of Time, in my opinion, pardon the pun, is a timeless story. Unlike more famous superhero game series, Edge of Time doesn't bother to create a self-contained universe, nor does it reinvent the mythos as a whole for a brand new audience. Rather, it takes a path far less traveled whenever it comes to mainstream media outside of comics. That path being the most simple way to create any adaptation, in my opinion. The reason I believe Spider-Man: Edge of Time is the ultimate comic book to game adaptation is because it's a fun, exciting, definitive Spider-Man story held together by an equally excellent gameplay experience. But before I elaborate on why that is, hello, my name's Nicholas, but it's Nick for short, and I do character and game analysis on some of my favorite franchises of all time, but that's enough with the introductions. Sit back, relax, and get ready to pay a fortune to play this game for yourself, because this is Spider-Man: Edge of Time, a pure comic book experience. To briefly go back to that comment about paying a hefty price for this game, as I'm sure you've noticed, the footage on screen has some pretty pixelated textures and some low poly models, and that's because I'm reviewing the Wii version of this game, which to its credit manages to be as equally technically impressive for the hardware as its HD counterparts are on the Xbox 360 and PS3. That being said, even though the HD versions look graphically superior, the gameplay is entirely the same. So really the only difference is the fact that you'll be paying at least $60 for this game on better systems. Sometimes I see it go as high as $130 in price online. Lucky for me, however, I already owned the Wii version, but wanting to make sure that my footage at least had high resolution, I found a workaround. And the explanation behind this predicament is the reason for this game, and all other Activision-published Spidey titles' scarcity, is their removal from digital marketplaces after Marvel gained the video game rights back. At least that's the explanation I remember it being. And although I do to an extent understand Marvel's motivation behind this, Beenox Spider-Man titles are some hidden gems from the last generation of consoles, so it's a shame they're gone, on top of the fact that game preservation is just a good thing to support in its entirety. But with all that said, let's talk about the story of Spider-Man: Edge of Time. This is easily one of my favorite aspects of the overall package. That's not to put the other qualities of the game down, but rather to show just how high the bar is for this one. In the distant future of 2099, Act 1 begins. And what a beginning it is. The story has one of the most impactful openings in a game I have ever experienced. You take control of Peter Parker, Spider-Man, against Anti-Venom. The fight begins and all seems to be your typical opening tutorial boss fight, but things quickly take a turn for the worse. Anti-Venom grabs Spider-Man as we see Miguel O'Hara in the year 2099 telling Peter to hang on just a second longer. Peter is thrown to the floor, drained of his powers. This is no longer a boss fight, it's a fleeting effort to stay alive. The player can only throw weak and slow attacks, leaving the best course of action to be desperately getting as far away from Anti-Venom as possible. Just walking in a straight line is a struggle for the player, as Peter can't help but stumble in his weakened state. The monstrous symbiote pins Peter to the ground. As Anti-Venom creates a weapon from his hand, O'Hara realizes he's too late and screams Peter's name through the portal. Peter! Peter! Then we see a sight I will always find to be one of the most iconic in the Spider-Man franchise. Miguel O'Hara holding a dead Peter Parker in his arms. As I said earlier, this is a childhood classic game of mine, but specific events and set pieces I had all but forgotten, but not this opening. From a storytelling and game design perspective, this opening is such a brilliant hook. It introduces two characters hardly known to mainstream audiences, creating an instant want to discover more about these characters. But also has you play through a very dark and grounded scenario of Spider-Man being powerless and beaten to death. It is just a great example of a cold opening. It puts you right in the action and makes you really want to discover how this happened and who these other characters are. Next up, we get some admittedly clunky exposition of O'Hara talking about his distrust of Walker Sloan's work at Alchemax, and now he's potentially messing with time travel under the company's nose. Since Sloan refuses to talk to O'Hara, he's going for a chit-chat as Spider-Man. The world of 2099 is a refreshing change of pace as far as Spider-Man games go. It isn't just another rendition of New York City, but instead a bustling metropolis of its own design. Its futuristic architecture is fascinating to explore and see. Miguel monologues about how he is a genetic scientist who works for Alchemax, so he could have walked into the building if he wanted, but he wouldn't have gotten the answers he needed from Sloan. I absolutely adore the shot of the genetics lab. Upon repeated playthroughs, you realize that these are the enemies you actually fight later on in the game, and I especially love this title drop. So subtle, yet so effective. One thing that I appreciate but will again admit it's clunky is the exposition dump in the ventilation shaft, but considering this is a video game, I understand that all this information needed to be somewhere. While spying on Sloan, we discover his true plan to travel back in time and start Alchemax years in advance to take total control over the tech world. Of course, Spider-Man 2099 won't have that and jumps in after him, but after seeing a vision of the Morph past, he realizes it's too late. In order to stop this problem at its source, he needs the original Spider-Man. The problem with that, however, is he's going to die before he can prevent this bad future. We then see the Morph Alchemax-ruled past. Fortunately, Peter and MJ are still together, not to mention Peter still being Spider-Man. But this detail right here is undoubtedly the weakest point of the game's story. The fact the entire fabric of reality was rewritten completely changed the past, and yet all of the most important aspects of Peter Parker's life are the exact same is pretty flimsy writing. Personally, I think it's intriguing and even understandable how Peter is so important to the Marvel Universe that he'd stay the same, but it's not super important, honestly, and isn't really talked about much after. He's still the same old spectacular Spider-Man. But back in the future, after throwing together a neural link program using Peter's DNA, something cleverly foreshadowed beforehand, the two can talk from various points in time. Something that I love about this story that is established here and will be seen later on is that these two Spider-Men are absolute geniuses. Whether it be genetics or robotics, both these Spider-Men are some of the most intelligent people on the planet, and I really like the fact that this game accentuates that aspect of Peter Parker and Miguel O'Hara. The two of them being scientists is actually one of the things that brings them together. After they've begun communicating, Miguel tells Peter not to go to the Gateway room on the 66th floor, but upon seeing Anti-Venom, Peter can't help but follow in order to save Eddie Brock within the symbiote and prevent the explosions before they take the whole building down. The opening of the story is primarily about Peter teaching Miguel what it means to be Spider-Man through his actions and the occasional lecture. The most prominent interaction is this one right here.
O'Hara, if you don't get that I can't turn my back on danger, no matter what the cost, then you've got no business calling yourself Spider-Man.
Wow, I'm hurt. Guess what else I am? Still alive. Let's hope you get to keep saying the same thing.
It showcases just who these characters are at the point in the story. Peter Parker is the paragon of heroism, and Peter teaching someone else exactly what it means to be Spider-Man well after they've taken up the mantle on their own is such a fascinating and unique dynamic. Both characters are capable and do want to do the right thing, but Miguel doesn't truly understand the responsibility he holds as a hero with his abilities. And the theme of responsibility being central to who Peter is and the growth that Miguel goes through throughout the story is absolutely fantastic. I just can't get enough of it. So Peter makes it up to the 66th floor where the time gate is located and finds Sloan alongside Anti-Venom and Audie Octavius, who in this reality isn't Doc Ock, rather his arms are just for research. Eddie Brock is trying desperately to fight against the symbiote, but the inhibitor chips placed inside of him by Sloan give the symbiote full control. Now we have the climactic battle, but unlike the opening, we can actually fight back, but that doesn't stop Anti-Venom from overpowering him. As the boss fight goes on, Peter's trying to show compassion to Eddie and help him fight back against the symbiote, but it just doesn't work. The inhibitor chips are too strong. In a moment of quiet reflection, Peter makes the decision to keep fighting to his last breath. Luckily, Miguel got to the portal just as Peter was on his last legs. Miguel is able to reach Peter and pull him into the future, and after putting him into a healing chamber, we've reached Act 2. In one of Miguel's most clever decisions, he goes to the past, leaving Peter to heal in the future. Although this may seem foolish, both the audience and Anti-Venom come to see that Anti-Venom can't drain Miguel's powers because his abilities aren't radiation-based. This advantage allows Miguel to remove Anti-Venom's inhibitor chips, giving Brock full control back. In retaliation, Eddie tackles Sloan and Octavius into the portal. Now, with both Spider-Man in opposite times and Eddie damaging the portal, they need to repair the portal to get back home. For the sake of not ruining the experience for new players, I'm not going over all the special unique interactions, but rather just sticking to the main moments of character development. After Peter wakes up from his regenerative slumber, he's met with large tentacles impeding his path. These giant white claws affect both Spider-Man and their paths, breaking through space-time at will. Now, first thing on the agenda, Miguel needs Peter to get the time machine schematics in order to get them back to their respective times. While gathering the gate's schematics, Peter and Miguel discuss how to boot it up. Mysteriously, Peter's voice grants him access to all the files, but they don't have time to focus on exactly why right now. And this is as good a place as any to talk about one, admittedly very out of character given its lack of screen time, struggle Peter is dealing with. He wants to stay in the future to avoid putting his friends and family in danger. To clarify, Peter's struggle between his responsibilities and his wants is integral to the character of Spider-Man, but that's not what I'm talking about whenever I say this is out of character. But Peter's want to stay in the future, away from his home, MJ, and all of his loved ones, that's what's strange to me, because there isn't really any time dedicated to this arc. It's very quickly brought up and then brushed off. Frankly, I think the story would have benefited from not even having it at all. But then again, maybe it is for the better, because without that doubt, we wouldn't have gotten this excellent scene.
Oh no, what's wrong?
It's Mary Jane. She dies. Tonight, right there at Alchemax.
How do you know? For shock's sake, Parker, what part of don't poke around in the archives was unclear?
Fine, I'm a nosy Parker, but now that I found out, it's
It's what? My job to save her? I've got enough to deal with.
You can't mean that. You can't just ignore that she's in danger.
Hey, I'm trying to focus on what's important.
What's important is not standing by and allowing someone to suffer or die because you do nothing. If you don't get that, then you don't get the first thing about being Spider-Man.
You're the one who doesn't get it, Parker. The future depends on...
My future is meaningless without her.
This is gonna be a huge mistake.
I owe you, Miguel. Big time.
Shocking right you do. But, well, maybe this'll help even the score for everything the world owes you.
Thank you. I mean that. Man, I must have been crazy to think about staying here. If people I love are going to be in danger, then I need to be there to help them.
Peter immediately regrets ever thinking about leaving behind his responsibilities, and Miguel going to save Mary Jane is what solidifies his growth as a character to accepting his responsibilities as the Spider-Man of the future and as a hero. It's just a great segment of the game that I absolutely love. And this is an aside, entirely removed from the game itself, but I just love the relationship between Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson. Mary Jane's self-confidence and show-stealing presence contrasting with the more timid, brainiac personality of Peter Parker is what is just so wholesome. I want these two characters to have way more common accurate focus on the big screen and, well, every adaptation. The relationship could carry an entire movie for Pete's sake. But back on topic of the game itself. After an encounter with a clone of Black Cat, Peter finds the mastermind behind this whole time travel operation.
Who are you?
I'm the CEO of Alchemax. The real question is, who are you, old friend?
Old friend. So this is where you make the big reveal and I say, holy cow, Norman Osborn, or the Kingpin, Jonah Jameson. Come on, please be Jameson.
All of them long dead, I fear. Too bad they didn't have access to the anti-aging drug we developed. It does wonders for you. And I do mean you.
Peter Parker of the future, who I'll be referring to as the CEO from here on out, lost everyone he'd ever loved on one fateful day, which we never get any elaboration on, which is a huge missed opportunity. Not only would it provide some serious justification for what led the CEO down this path, but also really tug at the heartstrings, imagining this character that you either love as a Spider-Man fan or have just grown to enjoy over this game, losing everything that he loves. The CEO is actually the one who founded Alchemax, and the entire scheme is to rewrite history so he can save everyone. This twist, although super unoriginal and keeping in mind the problems that I just listed a moment ago, still manages to stay in character with Peter. His intentions have no ill will, and he reasonably just wants a happy ending for himself, his loved ones, and everyone. But he's lost sight of the consequences of playing God, and that no man should ever have that type of power. Peter swings away from the CEO, determined to get back home. With the gate now functioning once more, both Spider-Men leap back into their proper time periods. But something else came to the past. An amalgamation of Sloane, Doc Ock, and Anti-Venom comes out, to which Peter so compassionately names Atrocity. This is where Act 3 begins. With the space-time continuum falling apart, our Spider-Men get to work. Our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man gathers Atrocity's DNA to send to Miguel. A simple task, as you can see. After some analysis, Miguel finds that Atrocity is weak to electricity given his connection with the time particles. Both heroes travel to their time's gateway room to end this conflict once and for all. After a fierce and climactic battle, Miguel O'Hara defeats the CEO and Peter Parker defeats Atrocity, solidifying their respective arcs of becoming a truly responsible hero and understanding the importance of never fleeing responsibility. This story is simply fantastic. I love it. The variety of twists it has on the Spider-Man mythos that come from the time travel is always engaging. Specifically, Atrocity is a standout villain. His presence as a threat turns this action platformer into a genuine horror game, and it's always a delightfully intense time whenever you're up against him. But what makes the story truly come to life is its faithful characterizations and palpable love of the Spider-Man characters and mythos. So, let's talk about...
You've got a lot to learn about priorities, pal. I'm gonna do what I think is right, and that means going after bad guys. You want a Spider-Man who'll do whatever you want? Go play a video game.
Peter Parker, the spectacular Spider-Man. Voice acting legend Josh Keaton returns to prove once again he is the definitive voice for Peter Parker and Spider-Man. His delivery, no matter the tone, is always spot on, and you can tell Keaton doesn't just love this character, but is this character once he's in the booth. Luckily, his great voice is complemented with some equally fantastic writing. His speech is of responsibility and heroism to Miguel, the fact he does everything in his power to save Eddie Brock before resorting to fighting him, and lastly, Peter's willingness to give his life for the greater good is so all beautifully in character. And once again, I want to bring attention to this moment of hesitation right here. Peter is only human after all, and no one wants to die, but he's willing to accept the consequences of this responsibility. It's tragically beautiful because it's so human, it's so Peter Parker, it's so Spider-Man. But another aspect of his humanity is what becomes one of Peter's best aspects in the entire game. He is a total sarcastic jerk.
You realize this time travel story of yours is gonna cost me my job.
It's not your job. It's not even your reality.
Yeah, that's what you keep saying, but how do you know?
Because I do. And deep down, so do you. Now let me concentrate. I have my own problems right now.
Yeah, well, I can't help you with that.
Maybe you can. Parker, you're making this harder for me, not easier.
I told you trying to control this quantum causality thing was a stupid idea.
They said penicillin was stupid too.
We're talking about the fabric of reality, not bread mold.
Just get ready to help me.
Bread mold! Sheesh, I cannot believe his crust.
He constantly tells O'Hara off about how he doesn't know him, is annoying, or a classic,
Hey, remember when you were telling me to hurry up? Right back at you.
Yeah, I'm doing my best to find that computer so I can bail you out.
I'll do better than your best.
It's hilarious to listen to. It makes the moments of camaraderie more impactful. It's really hard for me to articulate exactly what makes Spider-Man so funny in this game, but just in a blanket statement, the writing is fantastic. Peter rarely repeats the same lines to enemies because he always has a clever pun at their expense. It's just really funny, great stuff. The sense of humor in this game is right on. It is spot on Spider-Man. Now on to our second hero of this journey, Miguel O'Hara, Spider-Man 2099. I don't know a lot of the specifics of this character's backstory, rogues gallery, or the state of the Marvel Universe in the year 2099 as far as the comic book lore goes. But this is an excellent introduction to the character, as he has easily become my second favorite character to take on the mantle of Spider-Man, right behind the original of course. And although this playthrough of the game undoubtedly solidified Miguel O'Hara being my second favorite Spider-Man, he's been my second favorite ever since I was little whenever I first played this game. So needless to say, whenever he made a cameo appearance in Into the Spider-Verse, I was ecstatic, but knowing that he's going to be a main character in the Across the Spider-Verse duology, I cannot put my excitement into words. And with the trailer, oh, he looks so beautifully animated and we get to see a peek at the future. I cannot express how excited I am for that movie like everyone else. Oh, I cannot wait. But back onto the game itself. Miguel starts off the game more concerned with fixing the future and not so much caring about the consequences that negligence brings, such as people dying to save Peter or if they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And his perspective, although not morally correct, is somewhat understandable considering that the past is, well, the past to him. But because of Peter's influence, O'Hara learns that being a hero means you need to uphold the classic belief, with great power comes great responsibility, which, as previously mentioned, comes ahead in the mission to rescue MJ. He rescues her, and after her kind words, he realizes that's what makes Spider-Man a hero, and that's why the world owes Peter such a great debt, and finally comes to understand how to live up to those ideals.
Look, I just want to say thank you. You're as brave and unselfish as another guy who goes by the handle Spider-Man. You're a worthy successor to the name.
Thanks. I mean that.
Not to mention, his sassy snark always perfectly clashes with Peter, considering both are so headstrong. Plus, he curses a lot.
Oh, now I need to find a computer. Why is this shocking happening? Shocking right you do. Move, shocking, move.
See, in the future the word shock is slang, but I couldn't tell you what term it was for because it's universally applicable. He replaces every curse word you can think of with the word shock, and it never becomes inappropriate and kids aren't going to pick up on it, but older players like myself are going to find it pretty funny. The villains of the story are honestly pretty weak in my opinion whenever it comes to depth, but Atrocity as a concept and the presence he brings makes him one of my favorite enemies in any Spider-Man game, and the CEO needed more screen time to be sure, but his motivation was still believable if a little weak. But at least I can say there was some clever foreshadowing with the cloning of Black Cat and Peter having voice command abilities with the futuristic tech. And with the story fully covered, let's talk about the gameplay. Edge of Time, if I had to put it into one category, it would be a combat-oriented action platformer. Firstly, let's go over the combat itself. There are 3 buttons oriented around combat. Firstly, we have the close quarters moves, mainly punches and kicks. These are great for crowd control and taking multiple enemies down at once. The second attack form is range attacks, that serve to either close the distance between you and your foes or deal large amounts of precise damage. Undoubtedly what gives this combat system most of its depth is the 2 characters' dodge mechanics. Peter has his spider sense ability, which allows him to dodge all incoming attacks for a certain period of time. And if you activate the spider sense ability at just the right timing, everything freezes, allowing you to get more damage on your opponents than normal. For Miguel O'Hara, it's more of a typical dodge maneuver. It's a dodge roll, but it leaves a hologram duplicate behind to fool enemies. Both of these tools are incredibly useful, as one makes you basically invincible for a certain period of time, and the other one makes you invisible to enemies' lines of sight. Although they're only slight variations of a typical dodge roll in a video game, I think that extra Spider-Man flair really livens things up and makes these feel extremely unique. Lastly, there's the web shooting ability. What's most fascinating about this combat system is its unique skill tree and character playstyles. Peter is all about precise damage dealing. He has tons of devastating melee maneuvers and web smashes that kill enemies within seconds, but isn't the best whenever it comes to crowd control. Instead, that's where 2099 soars. Miguel doesn't deal lots of damage, but the speed and ferocity of his attacks allow lots of damage to multiple enemies all at once, allowing for a very loose playstyle. But the skill tree is probably my favorite aspect of the combat. There are 3 distinct branches: Amazing, Shared, and 2099. As you can see, you use spider tokens or XP to upgrade each specific Spider-Man's abilities in combat or health, either unlocking new moves or increasing the strength of old ones. Or of course, you can upgrade the shared portion to give both characters the same general benefits. I absolutely love this combat because of the large variety of combos and experimentation it encourages. By no means is it genre defining, but it's nevertheless an exceptional, enjoyable, satisfying system of gameplay. And thankfully, it's all very fleshed out because of the different amounts of enemies that you see as you go through the game. Each time the game becomes a little stale, a new enemy gets introduced and increases the strength of my previous praise. Now onto the topic of control. This game easily has the best control of any Spider-Man game, even comparing it to the Insomniac titles. The level of precision you get leads you to very rarely feeling lost or overwhelmed because of how many forms of acrobatic movement there are on top of lots of web-based recovery. As for the web slinging, with the game's level-to-level nature in mind, it's more than serviceable and highly enjoyable. It feels great. Unlike other modern Spider-Man titles, this game doesn't prioritize realism, but rather being a fun, well-controlled game. That's not to put down the control of other Spider-Man titles, but this one just feels more gamey, if that makes sense. Now onto something about this game I think is jaw-dropping to this day: the presentation. The presentation in this game makes it so timeless. The models are realistic but have the slightest tint of cartoonishness to them, and that's best seen through the animations. Although the character design and proportions are realistic, the snappy battle animations, dynamic posing, and inhuman fluidity between it all supplemented by tons of visual effects, makes it look like a comic book come to life instead of a live-action adaptation, which is a style I very much prefer to hyperrealism. One of my favorite animations in the game is something as simple as the running animation because of its bounce and rhythm. It just looks so good to me. And as mentioned at the beginning of the video, I reviewed the Wii version, but what is most impressive is the incredible cutscenes remain entirely untouched. This is definitely one of the best looking Wii games I have ever played. It blurs the line between HD consoles and the PS2 era. The only compromise between this and the HD version is texture quality and some model polygon counts, and the fact that the game looks this fantastic and runs as well as it does is a testament to the development team's work. Another important aspect of the presentation is the music. This game has one of my favorite soundtracks in all of video game history. Every track sounds appropriate to be blasted from the speakers of a movie theater. It rocks intensity, sadness, mystery. I can't do the soundtrack words, but every time I hear a specific musical cue or song being played, I immediately felt the feeling the composer wanted me to feel. It's amazing work. Lastly, I just want to touch on the overall aspects of the game design. The pacing is incredible by having separate individual missions, but all of them are so perfectly interwoven together that after each satisfying accomplishment, one more challenge pops up, but it turns out the other Spider-Man has to solve it. It creates this constant loop of endless accomplishments, with breaks of course placed after high-intensity situations. This, combined with the engaging boss fights, puzzles, and level structure, these levels are some of the best Spider-Man games have to offer with no low points. The levels are also just great in terms of their base construction, with a clearly laid out linear path, but the game still manages to give you nooks and crannies to explore with plenty of room for web swinging. This game is a thrill ride through and through. It's a race against time with expertly interwoven character arcs and story that always keeps the adrenaline pumping to the player, making them want to play just one more level, which is perfect considering how the game is structured to be one big level. It pains me to say that this game really only has a cult classic level of status, and although that's something that it deserves so much more. Although it's extremely hard to come by because of the stupid delisting of the game online, I do heavily recommend playing this game, whether you're just trying to get into Spider-Man if somehow you've managed to avoid him all this time, or you're just a Spider-Man fan and you want to see a great story accompanied by a great game. This is easily tied as my favorite Spider-Man game next to Spider-Man for PS4, because the two go for entirely different levels of gameplay, story, all of it's so unique to them, and each one accomplishes what they're going for so well that I can't help but pick them both instead of one. Spider-Man Edge of Time is not a movie tie-in game, it's not a comic book storyline brought to video game form. Instead, it is its own unique love letter to everything Spider-Man, and it's for that reason that it feels like such a great comic book that you can actually experience rather than just reading. If you are a Spider-Man fan or just enjoy a good fast action game, you need to play this game. With its awesome story, great engaging gameplay, and fantastic visuals, Spider-Man Edge of Time is a pure comic book experience. Hello everybody, and thank you so much for watching to the end of the video. I know that my channel is a lot of Sonic content, and although I do plan on keeping that a huge focus of the channel, I'm definitely going to be branching out into other games, series, stuff like that in the future, and this is just a taste of what's to come. So if you enjoyed this video, please let me know, and I cannot wait to see you in the next video. Please like and subscribe.